Yeah, let's pray and we can get things started. Would you please pray with me? Oh, Father, we do thank you for this Lord's Day. We thank you for all of your gifts to us, even the beautiful snow. Thank you that you preserve us and protect us and allow us to gather to worship you and study your church and your work in the church history. Bless us now, grow us in faith, and bless the children and their teachers as well. May your Spirit be at work and make us more like your Son. And we ask this in his name. Amen. All right, the children are dismissed at this time. All right, this morning we're going to talk about George Howe. Last week, I think I got into a little bit of what we've been covering, South Carolina, Presbyterianism in South Carolina in particular, well, North Carolina and Georgia as well. But we got into some of the educational institutions. So University of North Carolina was started by Presbyterians. But so were they had a lot of influence at South Carolina College, which is today the University of South Carolina. So those are public institutions. They also started colleges like Davidson College in North Carolina. But this morning we're going to talk about Columbia Theological Seminary. We got into it a little bit last week. With the founder was Thomas Goulding. I'll just write his name up here. So he was the first professor, Goulding. And he was from Georgia. But he doesn't stay very long. He's only there a few years. So Columbia Seminary is, of course, in Columbia, South Carolina. But it was, at least. It was moved later, 1927, to Decatur, Georgia, right outside Atlanta. And so that's tied in with kind of the changes of the seminary. Things may be going downhill from at least my perspective. But George Howe doesn't get a lot of attention. He's not maybe as well known as names, in the South like Palmer or Dabney or the like. But he's very important, and I'll explain why here. Let me give his years: 1802 to 1883. Well, one of the things we'll see is that he actually, he's from the North. He's from Massachusetts. But he ends up ministering in Columbia for over 50 years. So he's really the father of Columbia Theological Seminary. So that makes him a huge influence. And as we'll see, he wrote history. He actually wrote the history of Presbyterianism in South Carolina. He did this big 2-volume set. And he wrote on education, he wrote on the Bible, he wrote on a number of things. So he really was he was a theologian, but he was we could say an educator. So just massively influential there in South Carolina. So let me talk a little bit about his life, and then we'll get into some of the, you could say, controversies even in Columbia Seminary and some of its significance. Just to note, Columbia, along with Union Seminary in Virginia, were really the two major seminaries in the South. So you had those two, and then of course you had Princeton Seminary, which is in New Jersey. You did have some others in the North, but yeah. So these were largely influential. And one reason it's good to know about these two seminaries, Union and Columbia, is not only did they have a massively beneficial impact on the church in the 19th century, but they also had I think you could say, largely negative impact on the church in especially the early to mid 20th century, because the seminaries were a big driver behind theological liberalism. So anyway, it's good to have a good grasp of the seminaries. I think if you have a good grasp of Union and Columbia, you'll have a good grasp of Southern Presbyterian history and kind of the rise, and then we could say the decline. But anyway, even amidst decline, Columbia had a number of conservatives. They were actually they were the most conservative of the four southern seminaries, even in the mid-1900s, the other being Columbia and, Austin and Louisville seminaries. So those were a little newer, late 1800s. But Columbia even had a man, if you've heard of William Charles Robinson, I mean, he was there even, I think he retired probably in the 1960s or 70s. But, so even during the formation of the PCA, and he didn't leave, but Robinson was still part of the Columbia Seminary for a long time. Now, he obviously was a minority. He became one of the only conservatives there. Anyway, so that's noteworthy. Okay, so let's talk about George Howe. So he's the father of Columbia Seminary. He was born in Dedham, Massachusetts, November 6, 1802. This is interesting. His maternal grandmother was Rachel Gould, but her maiden name was Dwight. So she was the daughter of Samuel Dwight, who was a relative of Timothy Dwight, who was at one time the president of Yale, and I believe he was a grandson of Jonathan Edwards. So anytime you're from Massachusetts or something, congregationalists like that, you have some connections. Howe studied under tutors when he was young. His family moved to Philadelphia, so he actually spent some time there, studied under a tutor, and then he was actually converted. This is also interesting. He professed faith while attending First Presbyterian Church in the Northern Liberties in Philadelphia. And one of the things that sparked this was a home visitation from the pastor, James Patterson. And so I was just reflecting on that, and I think this just supports kind of the traditional practice, and we do it here, of pastoral visitation, and just where we get to go into people's homes, visit, see how you're doing. You can talk to the parents, kids, spiritually. In the Northern Liberties. I think that's the name of the church. It was in Philadelphia. I can at least tell you that. First Presbyterian Church in the Northern Liberties. That's what I think the name. I don't know if it's still around, but it's quite the name there. Okay, Howe studied under a pastor, Thomas Biggs, in preparation to attend Middlebury College in Vermont. So that's where he ended up studying, was Middlebury. He graduated from Andover Theological Seminary in 1825. Let me mention Andover. I've probably mentioned it a little bit before. But Andover Seminary, I think it was founded before Princeton Seminary, so I think it was 1809. And so that's in the Northeast there in Massachusetts. And the reason that's important is it was a reaction to basically the Unitarian theology of Yale and Harvard. So it was supposed to be a conservative response for the Congregationalists, and so it's I think it might have been the first seminary outside of like the colleges and whatnot. So it was a big deal, and then you had Princeton 3 years later. So he studied there, so you can kind of see Howe's background, and so I guess he grew up in that Presbyterian church, but he ends up in Congregationalism for a while. So he continues, when he graduates in 1825, he continues his studies as an Abbot scholar there for about a year and a half. He then, in 1827, is ordained as a minister, and he becomes the professor of sacred theology at Dartmouth College. So you can see some of these colleges used to be at least conservative Christian, no longer the case. Now, also Dartmouth was interesting. At the time, it had the president was Bennett Tyler. He was a pastor, congregational pastor, I believe. And he was a critic of Nathaniel Taylor and the New Haven theology. So this is kind of going back a while, but some of this we covered before. New Haven theology was, sometimes it's called Taylorism, after this Nathaniel Taylor. This was the most radical of the New England theology. They were denying things like original sin. And so Bennett Tyler, president of Dartmouth at the time, he was a critic of Taylorism. And so sometimes they reference this as the Tyler-Taylor controversy. I know that get confusing if you don't know who those two are, but very similar names. And actually, Tyler ended up helping form later the what was called Hartford Seminary, which you may have heard of. So Howe ends up as a pastor in the Congregational Church there at Dartmouth. So he's a professor of theology at Dartmouth and a pastor, but he resigns both positions in 1830. I think it was just due to health decline, overwork. So I mean, this happened with several guys. They want to escape the cold winters. Sometimes we understand that. And so he ends up moving south. That's how he ends up in South Carolina. He sails from Boston in November 1830 for the warmer climate of South Carolina. So he arrives. So he goes to South Carolina, 1830. So he's about 28 years old. Immediately when he arrives, I don't know how early, but it must have been pretty quick. He received a call as pastor of the First Presbyterian Church there in Charleston. So he's already desired to pastor. And remember, he had been congregational. He turns this down though. Instead, he's also offered a teaching position at the Theological Seminary at Columbia. So it's wild. You just arrive in a new town and you get offered all these jobs. So remember, we mentioned Thomas Goulding. Goulding had been teaching students at Columbia, and so he asked the synod there of South Carolina and Georgia for a teacher of Greek and Hebrew, and it just so happened that there were former classmates of Howe, Joseph Stiles and Aaron Foster, and they were classmates of Howe at Andover, and they had recommended Howe to the position. And so he's elected to teach the original languages, and then within a year, he's elected as professor of sacred literature and biblical criticism in 1831. So right off the bat, he pretty much gets hired at the Columbia Theological Seminary. He's also made the librarian, and they organized the seminary's curriculum in 1831, and he actually followed Andover's plan, so that Andover Seminary's plan of their curriculum was actually influential because Howe studied there as to how he sets up Columbia Seminary. So while he was there, a professor, Howe, as I mentioned, he was there 50 years, so that's why he shapes the whole seminary. He's called the founder, or father. Not really the founder, he's the father of the seminary. He listen to some of the students he taught. He taught, one of the early ones was John Leighton Wilson. He was I'll probably talk a little bit more about him later, but he was a missionary to West Africa. And so he was a well-known missionary there. And he comes back and he actually serves, I think, the missionary board for the Southern Church. But he's well known. He also taught I think it's I.S.K. Axon, who was the grandfather of Woodrow Wilson's wife. As I've mentioned before, Woodrow Wilson, his father, you may not know this, Woodrow Wilson's father was the first stated clerk of the Southern Presbyterian Church, the Confederate Church is how it started. What's his name? It's Wilson. Blanking on the first name. Anyways, that's Woodrow Wilson's background. And then Benjamin Morgan Palmer, so the younger, the great preacher from Louisiana, or he's from South Carolina. He ends up in New Orleans for a long time, like 40 years. So Howe trains Palmer as well, and he also trains John Giardeau. And Giardeau ends up being one of the great preachers, but also great theologians. He ends up teaching at Columbia for a while. So we'll say more about him later. But you can see how is an influence on a number of these individuals, important individuals. He had other offers to go elsewhere. Union Seminary, New York. There's a Union in Richmond or Virginia, but also Union, New York. He had an offer there in 1836. He turns that down. He ends up being the moderator of the Southern Presbyterian Assembly. The PCUS is the name of the church, and that's 1865. He received honorary Doctor of Divinity from the University of North Carolina in 1833. So again, that shows the religious nature of the University of North Carolina. They're offering Doctor of Divinities to a seminary professor. He also served for many years as the president of the Columbia Bible Seminary. So he really was a faithful educator of ministers. Towards the end of his life, they had a congratulatory address for his tenure at Columbia Seminary. And I read his address, it's really good. He pointed to God's sovereignty. So he's looking back on his life, and here's this quote. He says, "For he, our master, ruleth both in the armies of heaven and the inhabitants of earth, and none can stay his hand or challenge his right thus to rule." He goes on to say, "It is he, my brethren, who has called us to our lifelong work and will sustain us in it, and call us home at last to that house not made with hands, which is eternal in the heavens." And so he's just praising God for his sovereignty, even in bringing him to Columbia and working in and through him, and just as he works in and through all of us in our vocations. By 1881, and he dies, 2 years later, so by 1881, Howe had trained 550 students. That's a lot of students. I don't know if all of them went to be pastors, but most of them. In fact, he said, reflecting back, he said, this was 1881, more than 3/4 of the ministers and licentiates of the Synod of South Carolina. So he trained more than 3/4 of the ministers and licentiates of the Synod of South Carolina, more than half of those of the Synod of Georgia, about 1/3 of those of the Synod of Alabama and Arkansas, and nearly 1/2 of the Synods of Memphis and Mississippi were students of this seminary, Columbia. So, again, this shows why the seminaries are so important. It shows why when they were Orthodox and had good professors, things were going quite well in the Presbyterian Church. But when the seminaries declined, and it's not the only factor, but you can see why it would have such a massive effect on the church. Howe was married twice. His first wife died after a year of marriage. His second wife had been a widow. Excuse me. And they had 5 children together. But his wife, Sarah McConnell, had a child already that she brought into the marriage, Augusta McConnell. So that was George's stepdaughter. And she ended up marrying B.M. Palmer, Benjamin Morgan Palmer, the great preacher of New Orleans. Also upon marrying her, Sarah McConnell, Howe became the owner of his wife's plantation. So she had a plantation in Halifax and then 6 slaves. So though he was from the north, he ended up still becoming a slave owner and had plantations. But here's a couple interesting things about this. He had 2 of his slaves, Caesar and Tony. They both were allowed to accumulate their own property. So that probably wasn't the norm, but some slave owners allowed this. So they accumulated their own property, including animals, and Caesar even owned a buggy and a wagon, which made him one of the wealthier slaves of the day. But there's also the account that during the war, right, the Civil War, Caesar's wife reported that Union soldiers took their horse and buggy, their animals, and their food. So the soldiers were not always great towards the slaves. When they came in to free them, they stole their stuff sometimes. Okay. Howe's 19-year-old son, Willie Howe, enlisted for the Confederacy, but he died from typhoid fever a few days after he contracted it. During the war, Howe left his plantation, Liberty County. He actually stayed in Columbia to protect his family and the seminary. So he was trying to protect Columbia during this period. And he died in 1883, April 15th. So how he died is also interesting. This is, I like to think about this. We think, man, it's so dangerous today with cars, and that's true, right? People die in car crashes all the time, get injured. But people were also injured a lot from horses. And he was thrown from his carriage, and he broke his leg following the Lord's Day service, and then he dies 2 weeks later as a result. And there was a number of men who died related to especially when they were older. I think Benjamin Morgan Palmer also, he was in the streets of New Orleans, and I believe he got hit by a horse and carriage, and that resulted in his death as well. So don't think cars are the only, it's just modern technology that's dangerous. No, there's always been dangerous things, right? Just different technology. John Girardeau delivered a eulogy for George Howe before the Alumni Association on May 9th, 1883. And he praised Howe for his purity, his humility, his unselfishness, and gentleness. So Howe was praised not just for his abilities, but also his moral character, his virtue. His gravestone simply reads, it's actually at First Presbyterian Church in Columbia, which is part of the ARP now, I believe. That's where Thornwell pastored some. So his grave is there, and it says, "Though through more than 50 years, a faithful minister of the gospel." So that's all. I think that's all it says. But that's a good description of George Howe. So let me talk a little bit about Columbia Seminary now. So that's kind of overview of Howe's life. But we'll tie him in here. Remember, Howe helped craft the curriculum of Columbia. And he follows Andover Seminary's plan, Andover in Massachusetts. And he uses Moses Stuart's translations and treatises, and then Leonard Wood's works. And both of those were professors at Andover, I believe. So he's using Northern theologians, they're both Congregationalists actually, not Presbyterians. So he's using their works, and this maybe raises some questions. But one thing I want to note here is just the New England influence on Columbia. And there's a number of things that I want to highlight here that I think illustrate this point. Is that Columbia, though it's a Southern seminary, in a sense Southern Presbyterian, I think this is just fascinating, it has a significant New England influence. And so we could really say it's a convergence of Scots-Irish Presbyterianism and New England Puritanism. So that's maybe a different element than Union Seminary in Virginia. So let me give the evidence. George Howe originated from New England, as did one of the other early professors, Aaron Whitney Leland. I mentioned him last week. So he was there. So you had Howe and Leland were there for a while, both from New England. Thomas Goulding, though he was from Georgia, the founding professor, if you recall, he studied in the North. He actually went to Yale, and then he decided not to go there because of the hazing situation. And so he still ends up studying in the North, and his wife was from Connecticut. So he takes her back to Georgia when he moves back to the South. So all of those professors have New England influence. There were several early students that graduated from New England colleges. So a number of them were going up to the New England colleges. That would include B.M. Palmer. The president of the seminary's board of directors, so the first board of the seminary, the guy who's listed first, who was the president, was B.M. Palmer Sr. I mentioned him. He's uncle of the more famous Benjamin Morgan Palmer of New Orleans, pastor of New Orleans. This B.M. Palmer Sr., so he's head of the board, he pastored a congregational church in Charleston. So he himself was Congregationalist. And then later professors, B.M. Palmer Jr. taught there for a little bit, as did William Swan Plumer. If you've ever heard of him, he's got a number of books he just wrote a lot of practical books, commentary on Romans and books on the Psalms. So Plumer's kind of well known, and he ends up there towards the end of his life, and he's from the North. But Palmer Jr. and Plumer were both descended from those who came to Plymouth, Massachusetts in 1621. And the same goes for George Howe. George Howe's grandfather, Thomas Howe of Dorchester, was lineally descended from those who landed at Plymouth Rock. So these guys have a pretty strong northern, or we could say New England Puritan legacy. There's other things, but that really, I think, makes the point, is that this seminary was not just pure, it wasn't purely Southern, it had a lot of New England influence. but it still was a Southern Presbyterian seminary. Now, this raises an issue, though, because Howe gets there, and he had studied at Andover, but he also had some influence from some of these, there was this New England theology going on. And so Howe, he had studied under Leonard Woods, and when he came to Columbia, he initially adopted some form of what was known as the governmental atonement view, which was associated with the new divinity. Now, just a note on that. The governmental atonement view basically said that Christ died to show how serious sin is, and how God, it shows God's justice. But sometimes, often, and I don't think this is wrong. It's only wrong. Dabney points out this is only wrong if you deny penal substitutionary atonement, right? Yes, Christ's death does show God's justice and displays that He hates sin and the like. But you can also affirm, and should also affirm biblically, that Christ died in our place. He died for our sins. And so that was some of the concern, is that Howe was teaching this governmental atonement view. He was using, or some of his earliest textbooks he used at Columbia were lectures printed by, the printed works of Woods, Leonard Woods. And just to note, Woods was an opponent of Taylorism, so he's an opponent of the most radical New England theology, but he was a Hopkinsian. So that takes us back to some of these distinctions. Taylorism was the most radical. They were, deny original sin and things like that. But Hopkinsianism was more mild. I think it's still erroneous, but sometimes it was almost an in-between theology. But it raised some concerns. But just to show the concern over this, at least initially in the South, with the New England theology. Now, eventually New England theology doesn't go anywhere in the South. But you had the first president of the college, South Carolina College, was Jonathan Maxey. And he was a Baptist minister, and he also advocated the governmental doctrine of the atonement. And so there was concern here. Let me at least note this. In the South, the new divinity really did not take off. There was one exception to where it did actually grow, and that was in East Tennessee. And East Tennessee is kind of its own thing anyway. They didn't join the Confederacy during the war. They just remained, they were with the Union, but kind of wanted to remain independent. So East Tennessee, the new divinity took off there. And that was 1795, Presbyterian minister Hezekiah Balch, and that's B-A-L-C-H. He went to New England to raise funds for Greenville College, and then he read Samuel Hopkins' System of Doctrine. So that's the whole Hopkinsian term. The Synod of South Carolina, actually, of the Carolinas, the Synod of the Carolinas charged Balch with teaching false doctrine in 1798, and that was actually sustained by the General Assembly. So the Southern Church actually Synod went after him. Balch's colleague Isaac Anderson also promoted the new divinity in East Tennessee, though it might have just been Hopkinsianism. And he trained 159 ministers there. It was called the Southern and Western Theological Seminary. Eventually it was called Maryville College. It became a college, which instructed students until 1855. So you had a couple of ministers there in East Tennessee that were associated with this new divinity, but for the most part, this stuff did not take off in the South. The South was much more orthodox, and as I pointed out last time, Unitarianism didn't take off in the South, but neither did some of this New England theology. But to show how serious the concern was early on at Columbia Seminary, as I said, there was the fear that Howe had brought the new divinity to Columbia, and Thomas Goulding was still there at the time, and he was very concerned. In fact, Aaron Leland, the other professor, in 1834, he wrote a letter to Thomas Smith, who was the pastor of Second Presbyterian Church in Columbia. And so Smith himself was well known. Leland wrote to Smith, he said, "The state of the seminary is bad. We talk of peace, but there is no kinship or cordiality. the efforts of Dr. Goulding against Dr. Howe are secret but untiring. So he's saying Goulding's going after Howe. And he said the accusation is now heresy. So this is serious. And there was concern that Howe was being charged with heresy. However, there was a board of visitors, an official visit, and this restored harmony and confirmed Howe's orthodoxy. So I don't know if we know exactly what happened here, whether Howe modified his position or just there was just, they weren't sure exactly what he held. There was clarification. But Howe is orthodox. His orthodoxy is confirmed, and then, of course, he's there for a long time after. If you recall, the old school, new school split was in 1837 and 38. All right, we'll just say OS, new S. I'm not writing all that. All right, old school, new school split, 1837, 38. So that's happening in the church more broadly, but this is important because it affects Columbia Seminary. The professors of Columbia affirmed some resolutions that were drawn up by the Harmony Presbytery that endorsed the old school. So Columbia, and this would even tie in with the concerns over New England theology, is Columbia going to follow the new divinity and some of the new school influence, or are they going to be an old school seminary? Well, it's very clear that they become an old school seminary. The Synod of South Carolina and Georgia, so it's one synod at the time, in 1838, it elected a man named John Witherspoon. It's not the same John Witherspoon that associated with the College of New Jersey, though I believe he's a descendant of him. So they elect John Witherspoon and James Henley Thornwell, the famous theologian and preacher. They elect them both to the seminary's board of directors in 1838. Thornwell then presents a paper to the synod that year commending the old school doctrines. He says things like, for example, quote, Christ was actually the substitute of a chosen seed and rendered a true and proper satisfaction to divine justice on their behalf. So that's the substitutionary atonement language. Let me read that again. Christ was actually the substitute of a chosen seed and rendered a true and proper satisfaction to divine justice on their behalf. So that might, that can tie in with the governmental view, but it's also affirming this substitutionary language. Thornwell also affirmed that Hopkinsianism, which is this more mild error, he still says it's an error, though not of the same degree as Taylorism. So here's what he says. Hopkinsianism, quote, though a milder form of error than Taylorism or Pelagianism, which basically Taylorism was Pelagianism, it was denying original sin. So though a milder form of error than Taylorism or Pelagianism is inconsistent with the Presbyterian standards. And the vote was 49-8 in favor of this resolution, and both Howe and Aaron Leland were in the affirmative. And so this set the school on a path of, set the seminary on the old school path, at least for many years, at least till 1880. I should note there was also a proposal from the Synod of Virginia and the Synod of North Carolina. Both of those supported Union Seminary. They actually made a proposal to the Synod of South Carolina and Georgia to merge the two seminaries in the South, Union and Columbia. That would have been quite interesting, but the plan never took place. So they kept the two separate. Okay, so it's interesting. There is this concern. You bring in this northerner, George Howe, concern over some of the New England theology, and hence the new school, which is basically where all that came out of. But Columbia is firmly in the old school. Go ahead, Mark.
The inquiry into Howe and his orthodoxy, was that where that fit relative to the old school?
Yeah. So that got worked out a couple years before, like 1830. 1834 was when Leland said the accusation was heresy. So this is only like so then you have the old school, new school split, which is definitely tied with the New England theology. It's not the only issue, but it's definitely there. But so it got worked out before that. But then it's solidified because when you have the old school, new school split, you had to make it clear that you're joining the old school. There was a new school church in the South, but they were small. The majority of the South went with the old school. And that's not true of the North. The North was more evenly split, new school, old school, new school, old school. Any other questions? Go ahead, Charlie.
What's the policy of your
They're Congregationalists. So the Congregationalists, so here's the thing, Congregationalists, they're technically independent, right? So that's the big thing that would distinguish them from Presbyterianism, is that they don't have presbyteries. But they often were very similar theologically to Presbyterianism. Like I mentioned once before, Jonathan Edwards praised Presbyterian polity, and he even said he could subscribe entirely to the Westminster Standards. So, but a lot of the Congregationalists, I think, saw the problems with independent churches, and so they would often form associations. So it's kind of today, like the Baptists. Baptists are technically independent. They don't have presbyteries. But what's the largest denomination? It's the Southern Presbyterian, Southern Baptist. Southern Baptist Convention, SBC. So they have a convention instead of an assembly and presbyteries and the like. So they still want some sort of connectionalism. It's just a different, maybe looser form of government. So the same was with the Congregationalists. Yeah, go ahead, Mark. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I do think presbyteries. I mean, there's the biblical, theological arguments, but there's also just kind of the practical. It's just good to have. It's good to have connections with other churches and ministers, but also just a way to adjudicate problems that happen within churches. Now, of course, it's not perfect, right? You still you can have problems with presbyteries and assemblies, and in fact, when an entire presbytery or assembly goes liberal, that does create problems. I mean, that's what happened in both the northern and southern churches. Is they became majority liberal, and then eventually they drove out the conservatives. They were, I mean, like you think of Machen, they defrocked Machen in 19. I don't remember what year that was. Dave might remember. Late 1920s, maybe somewhere around there. 29. Anyway, but the point is that, I mean, yeah, so Presbyterianism, Presbyterian government, here's maybe the point. Presbyterian government in and of itself is not it's not security against theological error or even moral depravity. It has to be, I think it's the best system, but it has to be tied with godliness and faithfulness to Scripture. And when that doesn't happen, Presbyterianism can also become a force for bad, right? Because it does involve some form of it's a power structure. So, and there's been different ways of structuring things. Back in the day, the assemblies and synods had more power. Today, in like the PCA, the presbyteries have more power. We speak of more grassroots efforts. So we have just a less powerful. It's more bottom up hierarchy than top down. So I don't know. I guess you could say pick your poison. But okay. Any other thoughts or questions on all of that? Yeah. No. This is good. This is good.
When you talked about Princeton, you talked a lot about how it was a northern school with a lot of southern influence and southern people.
Yes.
It's kind of an interesting mirror. It's a southern school with a lot of northern people and northern, maybe not influence, but maybe some. Interesting mirror. So I was going to ask, in the old school, new school split, you know, how did things develop? Like the relationship between Princeton and Columbia? What, you know, is there anything interesting in the?
Columbia was probably too young of a seminary to have too much ties with Princeton at the time. Princeton was trying to play, during that whole division, they were trying to be the neutral party. They sided theologically with the old school, but they were trying to kind of keep things together. But eventually things got too divisive, and they sided with the old school. So Princeton went with the old school. But it is interesting to think, and that's a good point, is that is that Columbia is kind of the opposite. They have a lot of northern influence, but they're a little different. They have northern influence with like their professors, some students, but for the most part they're feeding the southern church. They weren't getting a lot of northern students. They had some occasionally later on. But northern students would mostly go to northern seminaries or Princeton, but Princeton had a lot of southern students, but part of the reason Princeton had a lot of southern students was, well, it was centrally located, right? It's in New Jersey. It's not too far. But also, for a time you didn't have, Princeton was 1812. Union was just getting started after that and had its struggles, and Columbia wasn't founded until 1830. So you had a long period, or at least 18 years, where you didn't have strong southern seminaries. So that's part of it, is why students were going up there. And that's also why the Southerners were like, we need southern seminaries. We need local seminaries where we can train our guys and keep them in the South so they're not getting lured away to northern churches. So I think that's a good point to think is, I would not support like a church just having one seminary. I don't think that's a good practice. I think it's good to have regional seminaries if you can. So, all right, any other thoughts or questions? Okay, let's talk a little bit about George Howe's writings. Howe published numerous books, sermons, and articles. I mentioned this earlier. His best-known book was his 2-volume History of the Presbyterian Church in South Carolina. It was published, first volume 1870, second volume 1883, so that must have been about the time of his death. Now that told the history of the Scotch and Scots-Irish immigrants founding Presbyterian churches in upstate South Carolina, as well as the Huguenots. We mentioned some of them settling in Charleston, the Low Country, and then the Covenanters in the Midlands. So he writes this work. Even though he's not from South Carolina, he becomes really the historian of South Carolina Presbyterianism. And he was, part of this was encouraged by the Synod. The Synod of South Carolina appointed Howe as its historian in 1849, and so that had begun the publication of several historical works. He was writing articles and the like, and then eventually formed this book. Okay, let's see. So some of those early things he'd written. He gave us, some of it was a sermon. I don't know if he might have preached that before, like the Synod on the early history of Presbyterianism, South Carolina. So some of those things were published as pamphlets and the like, and then eventually he put together the book. Let's see here. There was a memorial volume for Columbia Seminary. It was published after Howe's death in 1884, but it did include some. It had Howe's response, but also there's a good part in there because he gives a history of Columbia Theological Seminary. Does that make sense? He's the historian of South Carolina. He himself gives a very useful 1880. It might have been done a couple years earlier. Account of the history of the seminary. But really, Howe is the things he wrote on for the most part, though he was a historian, he was also a biblical scholar and an educator. So his writings did focus on Scripture. He edited an 1836 book that included 35 sermons from a man named Robert Means, who died about the age of 40. And he was a friend of Howe. And in there, he also included Means' essay on the Pentateuch. And so Means' essay was responding to Thomas Cooper's 1837 work, The Connection Between Geology and the Pentateuch. I'd mentioned Thomas Cooper before because he came from New England, and he was basically a Unitarian. He denied the faith. He was not an Orthodox Christian. And Thomas Jefferson tried to hire Cooper at University of Virginia, but the Presbyterians ran him off. and then he later became the president of the College of South Carolina. So you can see, and they eventually ran him out, but you can see he was an important figure, and so he had this book attacking basically the Pentateuch. And so Means was responding to that. He was criticizing Cooper, and then Howe was trying to make that more accessible by publishing it. And I mention all that because Howe himself was a firm defender of the Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch. So I know that this wasn't new in the 1900s or in our day. People were questioning Mosaic authorship even, this is as early as the 1830s, okay? So they're having to deal with these questions. This is Germany's introducing, it's really, a lot of it starts in Germany. The higher criticism, they're questioning authorship and all sorts of things, kind of picking apart, especially the Old Testament, trying to show errors and whatnot. And so Howe was defending Mosaic authorship. In 1832, his inaugural address at Columbia was actually on biblical interpretation. So that's his first address. He gave a sermon on the characteristics of the Bible in 1862. So he was writing on the Bible. He also spoke regularly on the subject of education. He really was an educator, which makes sense as a longtime seminary professor. He wrote a pamphlet in 1836 encouraging men to enter the ministry. It was called An Appeal to the Young Men of the Presbyterian Church in the Synod of South Carolina and Georgia. Now, I mentioned this before, but really, historically, at least in the American Presbyterian context, there has always been a shortage of ministers. And the reason is the Presbyterians have always demanded an educated clergy. And so this, I've said this several times, but this distinguished them from the Baptists and Methodists, which at least early on did not require significant education. And so they could find a lot more ministers because, well, you just take someone who wanted to enter the ministry or encourage him to do so. He didn't have to go through many years of education. They would just ordain him and he would go preach and maybe go out on the frontier as a missionary and whatnot. But the Presbyterians didn't do that. They would always require their preachers to get an education, which would require, early on would have been a college degree plus training with a minister. But later on, especially once Princeton's founded, the norm becomes going to seminary as well. So you're talking college plus seminary, so that's 7 years of formal education after your youth. So that's significant. And so this causes a shortage. I would say we still have a shortage even to this day. Though I don't know if people always put it that way or talk about it, but there is. And so I think Howe's appeal here is very relevant. He was concerned over, quote, the indifference felt by most young men of our church to the claims of the ministry. And then he said, with many, quote, pious youth choosing other professions and employments, which is fine sometimes, but if there's a need for ministers, he's saying we need more pious youth to enter the ministry. There were many Presbyterian pulpits that were unoccupied, and here's his quote. He said, and I think this even applies somewhat today, quote, the fathers are passing away, and few, lamentably few, are the young Elishas who shall take up the fallen mantle of the ascending prophets and fill the places they have occupied. So, of course, referencing Elijah who dies, but his successor, right, was Elisha in the book of Kings. Part of his encouragement to enter the ministry, Howe said the minister's office concerns greater subjects than the lawyer and statesman and even the physician. So he said, quote, far above them all are the studies and pursuits of the clergyman. The subjects he has to investigate are more noble and commanding, the ends at which he is obliged to aim more godlike, and the associations in which God places him in society more interesting and affecting. Now, of course, he's a seminary professor. He's going to say that. It's not to diminish the work of lawyers or statesmen or doctors or anybody else, but it's just to, I think, lift up the ministry. We don't want to devalue the ministry. We want to encourage men to enter it. He said, he was talking about vocation, and he says in this pamphlet, he says, quote, your duty plainly is to put yourself into that situation in which you can subserve, on the whole, the best interests of Christ's kingdom. So that may not be as a pastor, but whatever your vocation is, whatever God calls you to, that's what you should be doing, is put yourself, that's your duty, is to put yourself in the situation in which you can best serve Christ's kingdom. Right? I think it's a good way to summarize vocation, God's calling on our lives. But he even encouraged those who can't enter the ministry. They should still encourage others. He says, quote, "You can encourage worthy young men of piety and talents to prepare themselves for the ministry. You can furnish them the pecuniary means, if need requires." So that would be to help them pay for seminary and the like. "To sustain them through their course of study. And perhaps you are a father or mother and have a son whom you will, in your heart, consecrate to Christ for this service." So even training our sons to enter the ministry. I like this point. Howe even said, every particular church ought to have some of her sons in training for the ministry. And if you think about this, and he was talking about even, every church. I mean, think of like a church like our size. If we want to have pastors, then every church should be producing more pastors. Otherwise, you're going to have a shortage, right? You can't just expect the big churches to produce lots of pastors. I mean, they might, but we should, I think we have a duty to at least seek to train up pastors and send men out. And I'm thankful we have at least one that we've sent out in recent times. So that's great. But this is just a good mindset to have. I think this is good for even me to think about, is we need to, there is a need, and we should encourage men, particularly pious, capable young men, to enter the ministry for the service of Christ's church. And so Howe was an advocate of this, and he was trying to take on this problem that was even there in the 1830s. Maybe to finish here, he, at the request of the Charleston Presbytery, he gave a 1843 sermon on theological education. This became a book. It's called A Discourse on Theological Education. He explained, he said, quote, "All the professions are advancing. We must at least advance with them, and if possible, keep before them or be despised." I think Dabney and others made similar points, is that like they're increasing the training for law and medicine. We can't be behind. We need to also increase the training for ministers in a day where there's more attacks on the faith, and we just need a more educated clergy. So this is kind of just keeping with the past of Presbyterian practice. He even explained, I thought this is great, quote, "The Reformation was almost wholly affected by men of learning." Right? Do you think about that? The Reformation happened because there were men of learning. You think of the Reformers. These were the most educated men in Europe. And then they had the backing of the civil magistrate. That's really how the Reformation happened. So education is just that important. So maybe kind of to wrap this up, even though Presbyterians consistently faced a shortage of ministers, Howe didn't say, "Oh, well, let's lower the standards." He was a staunch defender of high standard for ministerial training. And he gave some other lectures on education and the like. He gave an address on the education of women in 1850. He contributed to children's textbooks. He wrote an article on ministerial schools and endowments. So he had his hands in all sorts of things. Okay, any thoughts or questions before we close? Go ahead, Charlie.
Just thinking, in science, you're building on the past and into new areas, discovering new things. But in the ministry, that's dangerous, isn't it?
Yeah, well, this is one of the problems of like the PhD program in theology is we don't want to encourage new theology. That's dangerous. I think PhDs are fine, like for history, historical theology, and the like. But I do think there is a danger with biblical studies and systematic theology, where people, and we've seen it. They feel the need to invent something new, and that often takes you in the territory of heresy.
I was listening to one of Steve Nichols' videos on Christianity in America, and a quote from Howe was that there was no new idea that comes out of Princeton.
Yeah.
The idea that we don't need to make up something that we have, which what we can do is
Absolutely. Now, there's been maybe some criticism of Hodge's statement because, like, for example, on his view of original sin, some would argue he didn't entirely follow Turretin as closely as he claimed. But despite that, his overall point is true, is Princeton was trying to preserve the past. They weren't trying to reinvent the wheel. So it's to pass on Reformed Orthodox theology and just train ministers up in it. But the challenge is always to deal with the challenges of the day, right? Is you still have to address those things. We still have apologetics and the like, but you want to maintain the Orthodox theology. And Princeton did that for 100 years, but not after. All right.
So you said there was a shortage of trained ministers. So how did that play out in real life? How did they handle that?
I mean, I think it's just always been there. I don't. It might have improved from the original point, but I don't know how much. The Presbyterian Church has always had a shortage. Now, who does it affect the most is the smallest churches, right? The bigger churches are going to get their ministers. But some of the country churches, like I've seen this when I was in Mississippi, and you just have pulpit supply. You go around and use seminary students preach. Go ahead.
These, pastors come out of families of wealth, because we're talking, he said, maybe 7 years of education. It isn't for free.
Oftentimes, but that was also tied with, you couldn't just enter college uneducated. So it would have been the wealthier families that had even greater means for earlier education. Though so many of the Southern Presbyterian pastors were wealthy or came from wealth, but not all of them. Like G.R. Doe actually came from not poor, but more like middle class family. So, but you probably didn't have a lot coming from the poor ranks. It's just my thought. I haven't looked into that too much, but.
Sounds like almost like a missionary idea. Then, if we're not getting pastors, and we said, it's almost like we have to give funds to get them educated. Some of them that don't have.
Yeah, and in fact, many of these schools didn't charge tuition, early on. They were raising funds, because the synods would contribute, the church would contribute they were running the seminaries. So anyway, okay, we'll have to stop there. Let's pray, and then let's do that. Oh, Father, our God, we do thank you for your work in Columbia Seminary. Thank you for George Howe and his example, and we do pray, Lord, that you would call more men to the ministry, that they would fulfill that call, and that you would raise up godly, competent men to serve your church, especially serve the Presbyterian Church in this day and age, and help us to even do our part in contributing to that. And prepare our hearts now for worship. We ask these things in Christ's name. Amen.